Now, about a year ago, I tried to make a video on how slope aspect affects microclimate and vegetation, but it didn't come out very good. Now that I have some more video making experience under my belt, I think it's time to give it another go. So without further ado, here's my video on how microclimate is affected by slope aspect. Now, aspect or slope aspect or topographic aspect, there are a few terms this geographic principle goes by, is in short, which direction on a compass a slope faces looking downhill. Looking downhill here, we are roughly facing south, so we are on a south-facing slope. Of course, we're on the north side of this valley or south side of this mountain, so you have to detach yourself from which side of a geographic feature you're on and only focus on which one the slope is facing. And in this case, it is facing south or equatorward. Of course, you can also report aspect much more finely than this, down to the nearest degree if you'd like, but this is rarely done to the inherently undulating nature of hills and mountainsides, so it's usually reported to the nearest 10 degrees or sometimes just even the nearest cardinal direction. Now, aspect on its own is not very interesting, but it has dramatic impacts on climate because of its ability to create huge variations in microclimate over short distances. And this all has to do with the way sunlight strikes differing slopes. So on a south-facing or equator-facing slope, because this is flipped around in the southern hemisphere, sunlight will naturally hit it at a closer to a right angle, because when you face south in the northern hemisphere, you are facing the sun. So the sun will naturally strike it at a, again, close to a right angle. And this leads to higher levels of solar irradiance per square meter or square foot, whatever unit you like to use. Meanwhile, on a north-facing or pole-facing slope, sunlight has to strike it at an angle, which reduces the incoming solar irradiance per square meter. Now, this can be a little hard to picture in your head, so I'm going to create a diagram to show you exactly what I'm talking about. One of the best ways to demonstrate this principle is with a laser pointer. Although it doesn't look great on camera, it should be just good enough to get the point across. Now, assuming this folded piece of paper is a valley in the northern hemisphere, with us facing east, this would be the south-facing slope, and this the north-facing slope. Holding the laser at a roughly 45-degree angle to the ground, which is simulate the average throughout the year of the sun at 45 degrees north, hitting the south-facing slope, we see it hits it almost perpendicular, so there's minimal distortion of a laser pointer. It is highly concentrated over a smaller area. Moving the laser pointer to the other side, however, we can see it's now stretched out. Even though the energy from the laser pointer hasn't changed at all, nor has the angle, it is being spread across a larger area. So naturally, per each unit, the solar irradiation, or irradiation from the laser in this case, has been reduced. This is sort of what it's like when the sun hits a north versus south facing slope. So now we understand how aspect interacts with sunlight, it should be very easy to see why it creates such high variations in microclimate. And there are a few specific mechanisms this works through. The most visible here right now is snowpack, because although both sides of this valley receive almost the exact same amounts of snowfall, over short distances at the same elevation, snowfall isn't going to vary all that much. One side is snow-free, and the other side will be covered in deep snow until mid-April. That's very obviously because this side receives a higher amount of solar radiation from the direct sunlight, so it naturally melts out very quick. Well, the other side, I mean, this time of day, doesn't even look like it's getting any sunlight, so it's just like when you put snow in the shade. It's going to last way longer than snow in the sunlight. This has some pretty major implications for our snowpack because it allows for us to have a much more controlled release of runoff, giving us a more consistent amount of water all throughout the year instead of just a big rush of runoff for a couple of months. Another important impact has to do with evapotranspiration, and this can be more easily observed in the summer because, again, when there's a rainstorm, precipitation will be almost exactly the same on both sides, but naturally on this side of the valley, the precipitation will evaporate a lot quicker, giving less time for it to soak deeply into the soil and less time for plants to soak it up through the roots, while on the other side, it will last for longer in the soil because it will evaporate slower, giving plants more of a chance to absorb it, and it will soak more deeply in, and maybe even continue to support runoff later into the year. And finally, this one's just obvious. One side of the valley is going to be a lot warmer, and one side will just be a bit cooler. And the culmination of these three things is that very different communities of plants can be found on either side. This community right here is dominated by Juniperus osteosperma, also known as the Utah juniper, and Quercus gambelii. You can see in the background there, or foreground, whatever, without any leaves right now. It's also known as the gambel oak. Get a few other species here as well that are more drought tolerant, such as the cheatgrass, Bromistectorum. That one's really not appreciated here because it's invasive. Also got Euphorbia myrsinites, a never terrible invasive, which I can't see right now, but I know is out here. Not to mention a couple of good natives, like the various rabbit brush species like Ericameria nauseosa and Chrysophanes facetoflorus, and some others. Now, Utah juniper and gambel oak are naturally drought-hardy species that can be found commonly on the Colorado Plateau, which is a drier portion of the state, as well as in the Great Basin, in addition to right here. And now that we're on a north-facing slope, the situation is once again clearly different. The ground is covered in snow, the trail is very icy, and I gotta be a little careful here. And the forest is very visibly different, dominated almost entirely by one species, namely Acer grandidentatum, commonly called the big tooth maple. And not a whole lot else. We also got this Physocarpus, or commonly known as ninebark, growing here. I'm not sure what species it is. If I had to guess, I'd say Physocarpus malvaceus, the mallow ninebark, but I can't remember. There's like 3 species in Utah, one of which is common and 2 of which are quite rare. And I can't remember which is which. Regardless though, these 2 species are commonly found in wetter microsites and wetter habitats in general. Certainly not in the deserts of southern Utah, as Juniperus osteosperma and Quercus gambelii are. And just look at how close those 2 trees are growing to this microsite right here. Can't be more than a couple hundred feet away. Yet due to the difference in microclimate on the 2 different slopes, these 2 species can grow next to the ones here in a very close proximity. Absolutely incredible. I gotta say, I don't think the biodiversity is very high on this side. There's a common misconception that wetter microsites or wetter climates are going to produce more biodiversity, but that's not always true. And I think it has to do with people thinking that rainforests are always the most biodiverse habitats, and that's generally true, but deserts can be pretty biodiverse as well. That being said, even though this microsite has a lower biodiversity, over large distances, having both north and south-facing slope communities overall has the effect of increasing biodiversity, of course. So just because a small patch of land, be it for edaphic conditions or microclimate, has a lower biodiversity does not necessarily make it a bad thing if over the long run it can cause an increase in biodiversity. It's a little bit complicated like that sometimes. Now right here at the back of this valley, you can see something quite interesting because we're at the transition from one slope to the other. You see very clearly that just a couple hundred feet away there, it's deep snow, and right here, it's quite patchy, but we were to this side, and it's suddenly all gone. And of course the species follow with Juniperus osteosperma right there, and Acer grandidentatum with its marvescent or marcescent, I can't remember what the term is, leaves that cling to the tree for winter even though they're already dead, growing right there. Absolutely incredible how much variation it can create in just a couple hundred feet. Now, one question you might have is there a difference between east and west facing slope in terms of microclimate? And the answer is maybe. Honestly, it's probably a good topic for another video, but generally what I would say is it is an effect that I think is observed sometimes, and it has to do with the fact that east-facing slopes catch the sun in the morning when the air is cooler, while west-facing slopes are always going to catch the sun in the evening when the air is hotter. So as a result of this, you get a sort of double whammy of heat that can lead to drier, hotter conditions on west-facing slopes, but it's certainly not as strong as the difference between south and north-facing slopes. And overall, I think it's definitely not as important regarded to most people. That being said, unlike north and south-facing slope, in fact, it can be noticed all across the world, even at the equator or at the poles. That brings me to another point I want to talk about, which is that the north-south aspect difference is most pronounced within the mid-latitudes, because when you're between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, you're at a point where the sun will sometimes be directly overhead, or sometimes even shining in the other direction. So sometimes it will be the pole-facing slope that receives the most sunlight, and this greatly negates the entire effect of aspect. I've seen some from Google Maps, some slopes in Oaxaca, Mexico at about 16 degrees from the equator that clearly seem to show an effect of there's a few things that could be causing it, but really in most places it won't be very strong until you get north of like 25 degrees and especially 30 degrees. So in Southern California, aspect is very strongly observed, and its effect on plants is certainly very strongly observed right here at 40 degrees north. And then once you get north of about 50 or poleward 50 degrees, it starts being less and less important again, because really the sun will always be quite low in the sky and both slopes won't receive all that much incoming solar radiance. Another important thing to note is that the actual steepness of the slope can matter quite a lot, because imagine a valley with very, very shallow slopes. The two angles will be basically the same, so it won't be a very big difference between the two. Well, if you have two cliffs that were, or basically two slopes that were vertical, one side would almost never get any sunlight if it was north of the Tropic of Capricorn, while one side would always get sunlight, so you can have a very big difference there. That's obviously an extreme example, but it is important to know that the actual slope, like steepness, matters quite a lot. And yeah, I think that's mostly all I want to cover. I probably will be remaking this video again in the future, to be honest. There's a few other videos I want to remake. But truthfully, I just think the first one I made was such a pile of hot garbage. I really want to try again. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.